Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss enhancing trauma-informed approaches, building trauma-conscious and person-centered practices in anti-trafficking work. Today, we will dive into the creation, history, and application of Project Trust curriculum, building and integrating trauma-conscious engagement. You will also notice that we have our lovely ASL interpreter in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and his name is Jonathan. So we are going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get through today, and to maximize our time together, we're going to get started on time. Project Trust is a national program focused on providing training and technical assistance to the human trafficking field through the Office of Victims of Crime. This program aims to support organizations across the country as they work to integrate a trauma-informed approach to each level of service delivery and the overall organizational structure. Project Trust is a collaboration between the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI, the Sinar Institute, and Brandeis University's Institute on Assets and Social Policy. Today, we have 3 goals during this webinar. We aim to provide an overview of the history and background of the curriculum, introduce our subject matter experts and content contributors who made the curriculum such a powerful resource, and explore the application of the curriculum within diverse anti-trafficking settings. Today, we will have 2 panels where you will hear directly from subject matter experts and stakeholders in the anti-trafficking field. Each expert will speak to the curriculum and share how the curriculum has or can be used within their roles or organization. So we just want to start with a few reminders of our training working agreement. When we hold these webinars, we really like to remind everyone that our goals are to maintain a safe space by allowing our colleagues to voice thoughts, questions, and concerns, and identify and help draw out the strengths that each individual brings to this training. We always want to communicate with respect and participate in discussion with an open mind, because that's how we are going to pick up on new skills and make great connections. To assist with our questions, Sonar's intern, Jenna Lukowitz, and our Thrive supervisor, Frank Blaney, will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, they will be answering them in the chat. If you have questions specifically for our panelists or about the curriculum or content, there will be an audience Q&A session following the end of both panels. And you can always just drop your questions into the Q&A feature so that we can monitor them and answer them in real time if that is the best place to answer them. The goal of the webinar is to make it as useful and impactful as possible, so I encourage you all to join in the conversation. So before we jump into our content, we want to provide some brief reminders on self-care as we move through this content. If you need, feel free to step out for a moment, grab something to drink to stay hydrated, or move your eyes away from your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Sinar website following today's live webinar. So before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Naja Martin, and I'm here as a member of Project Trust and Sinar Institute. My role within Project Trust focuses on providing comprehensive training and technical assistance to organizations striving to implement a trauma-informed lens to every level of their work with individuals and individuals with lived experience in the trafficking field. At Sinar, I am the Thrive Initiative's Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator, where I provide high-level assistance to organizations both domestically and internationally. Previously, I've worked at the National Human Trafficking Hotline, working directly with individuals who are in crisis. So right now I'm going to pause for a moment because we want to hear a little bit about you. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. So if everyone could respond to this poll with the best description of your agency or organization, that would be great. I will pick up again in 1 minute. We have about 15 seconds left, so if you have not answered the poll, please do so. Okay, thank you very much for your participation in that poll. And we're going to move right along. So now let's move along to discussing the history and a brief overview of the curriculum. Project Trust is a collaboration between three entities: the Sonar Institute, USCRI, and Brandeis University's Institute on Assets and Social Policy. Each partner played a pivotal role in the creation of the curriculum. Sonar Institute served as the primary content creator of the curriculum. We leveraged our internal expertise and trauma-informed clinical support for individuals who have lived experience of human trafficking, our lived experience leadership, and our rich history of supporting agencies providing services within the interpersonal violence field to create a well-rounded and foundational resource for the larger anti-trafficking field. Sonar Institute has also served as the primary partner providing training and technical assistance to organizations serving survivors throughout the United States for the lifetime of this grant. USCRI served as the primary administrator of the Project Trust grant over its lifetime. USCRI and its staff supported the creation of the curriculum and ensured a smooth technical launch. Our partners at Brandeis University were pivotal in supporting the creation of the curriculum. Brandeis served as the primary evaluator of the grant and led all of the data collection, outreach, pilot testing, and the final evaluation of the curriculum. So why was the curriculum created? Prior to the development of the curriculum resource, Brandeis led outreach to direct service providers in the field to gather data on areas of need to support stakeholders in their engagement endeavors. Based on the information collected from this outreach, Sonar and USCRI were able to focus the curriculum to meet the needs of direct service providers. The curriculum was created to provide a foundation from which all stakeholders could draw from to integrate principles of trauma-informed care and engagement directly into their work. Lastly, this curriculum was created to share practical resources and to equip stakeholders with best practices that value survivor experiences and avoid re-traumatization. Additionally, we thought it was of extreme importance to also explore the unique impact of working within the anti-trafficking field for stakeholders. As helping professionals, we're each impacted by the stories survivors choose to share with us and by the immense privilege of walking with survivors on their healing journey. Because of this impact, this curriculum also highlights tools and skills to mitigate vicarious trauma and is a starting point for many stakeholders who may need to turn inward and care for themselves. So how did we determine the scope of the curriculum? At the outset of the curriculum development, Brandeis conducted outreach to anti-trafficking stakeholders across the country. Based on that outreach, it was determined the scope of the curriculum should include the context of historical or cultural trauma, the physical impacts of trauma on the brain, and best practices to building rapport with trauma survivors. There are three main areas that were really important to Sonar and our collective staff and our collaborative partners in this training. Sonar, as an organization, is composed of specialized trauma clinicians and educators, many of us who have lived experience in healing from complex trauma. In addition, all of our work is informed by individuals and communities we have served through direct services. As such, through this foundational resource, we wanted to ensure that, one, the training that we made was intentional and it was focused on creating accessibility for all audiences in ways that were only typically available for traditional clinical workers. It was also important for us that we broke down clinical terms into language that resonated with larger audience groups and stakeholders and really share that knowledge so that everyone has the tools to understand what happens to all humans when we experience trauma, both during the event of trauma and after the event of trauma. And Sonar was very intentional about including many examples of trauma manifestation throughout the curriculum to show the diverse ways that we are impacted by traumatic events. It was really important to us that the training had more than one perspective so that we could normalize trauma responses and make sure that every person who is serving survivors understands the adaptive neurobiological responses designed to keep us safe during abnormal events. So how did we evaluate the curriculum to ensure that it was something that was going to be useful for the anti-trafficking field? So we had pilot testing, and the feedback from pilot participants was incredibly pivotal to the production of the final iteration of the curriculum. Because the pilot group was so diverse and included so many perspectives, we were able to hone in on the patterns and feedback and apply that to the final iteration. Brandeis University, our key partner in Project Trust, was able to identify key changes that were shared across participants to make the training more effective. Their evaluation of the pilot was such an important part of getting to the final iteration and to make sure that we were including all of the changes that would be most impactful. Just to speak to the diverse landscape of anti-trafficking stakeholders and allied professionals, Brandeis sought participation from stakeholders located across the country, both in cities and in rural areas. We also made sure that we were including individuals who were from diverse backgrounds and roles within the anti-trafficking field, and those from various backgrounds and personal demographics as well. Each participant in the pilot completed a demographic questionnaire, the curriculum in its entirety, including all of the supplemental resources, a brief survey following each module soliciting feedback, and a 90-minute focus group following the completion of the full curriculum. Brandeis used each data piece collected to paint a full picture of the curriculum's effectiveness, helpfulness, and practicality. Overall, the vast majority of the feedback that we gathered from the pilot was overwhelmingly positive, with the majority of participants noting the material was somewhat or completely new to them. Understanding this helps SANAR and our partners avoid duplication of training efforts and ensure the content in the curriculum would be a new and useful resource for the field. Feedback gathered from the pilot included an increase in diverse subject matter experts utilized in the media portions of the curriculum. We streamlined the content and made sure we had distinct connections between the learning objectives and how they apply to the anti-trafficking space. We clarified the intent behind language use, especially when we talked about things such as survivor versus individual with lived experience. And there was a request to provide more in-depth information regarding historical trauma, such as the impact of slavery, the Trail of Tears, and other historically relevant events that have impacted generations that have followed, and how that aligned with trafficking. Finally, when we finalized the curriculum, we utilized all of the outcomes derived from the evaluation. So this included diversifying our videos, case studies, and language used across the curriculum and in the content facilitation. The SANAR team also moved to a narration system where I'm narrating one part and our COO, Jenna Panapaco Osorio, is now narrating the second part. And this final iteration really reflects countless feedback points from the pilot. And we're really excited to have the training reflect and include so many diverse subject matter experts, including some of our partners, such as Ashante Taylor-Cox, the founder and executive director of You Are More Than Incorporated. Additionally, SANAR held the feedback of the integration of the roots of historical and intergenerational trauma in high esteem, but we also recognize the limitations of this curriculum. Since this curriculum is a foundational resource for the field, we included a brief overview of the impacts of historical and intergenerational trauma as they pertain to marginalized communities. However, we also acknowledge the limitations of this very foundational resource, and we understood that we would not be able to do justice to the full spectrum of the impacts of these types of trauma in this one training. So to support further education and learning on these topics, SANAR added several resources at the end of the corresponding module that folks can look into on their own time and supplement their learning. So now that we have that brief history and background of the curriculum, let's go ahead and move ahead and hear from our first panel, our subject matter experts and content contributors. First, we are going to have Kate Keisel from the Sonar Institute. I'll turn it over to Kate to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Naja. I really appreciate that. First and foremost, I really want to thank our amazing ASL interpreters who are here. We have Kara, who is joining us from, as well as individual named Jonathan, and they are both going to be support us turning on and off. Oh, sorry, Carolyn, who is our second interpreter. Carolyn, thank you so much for your interpretation today. As Naja mentioned, my name is Kate Keisel. I am the co-founder and chief executive officer here at the Sonar Institute. At Sonar, one of our main points and areas that we hope to focus on is really focusing on the area that human rights involve healing from trauma and complex trauma, and what that means in terms of building sustainable solutions, pathways, and meaningful engagement with diverse communities. Our mission is really grounded in trauma-specific healing and wellness-based supports for both individuals, communities, as well as different individuals that have been impacted through their direct line of work. We do this through three specific ways. One, we work on healing and working towards wellness through our Wellness Center, which provides trauma-specific services, supports to individuals and families, as well as alternative long-term therapeutic interventions such as trauma-sensitive yoga, mindfulness, expressive arts and poetry, dance, and so many other things that we now know can lead us towards healing. In addition, we have our Thrive initiative, which is comprised of two different areas. One is issue-specific training that is truly focused on what it means to integrate trauma-conscious and person-centered practice at that meso and macro level of change, really truly understanding the impacts of trauma, but also recognizing the immense human capacity for resiliency, post-traumatic growth, wellness, and hope after traumatic events. And the last place that we focus as an organization is recognizing that this work that all of us do and lead is difficult. Many of us, including myself, who have lived experience with complex trauma, recognize that we're mitigating not only the impacts of exposure from secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, but also our own lived experiences. And Sonar finds it a huge priority and placement of resources to support those of us who are doing this work within the field by providing support and training that can create cultures that are grounded in really thriving and empowering environments. In addition, my work is informed by my own lived experience with complex trauma healing and a blend of that golden academic and clinical training as a trauma therapist. I've been fortunate to be in this field for over 15 years and walked alongside thousands of individuals and communities on their own healing journey. In addition, today I am just humbled to be in the presence of such amazing panelists and wisdom who have been a part of this journey. I thank each of you for being here, and I am so excited for the content that we are able to share today. With that, I will pass it back over to Naja to introduce Ashante Taylor-Cox, one of our very valued partners from YAMT.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashante Taylor-Cox.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Ashante Taylor-Cox. I am the executive director and founder of You Are More Than, Inc. We are the first and only survivor-led nonprofit based here in New Jersey, supporting BIPOC and LGBTQ+ survivors of domestic trafficking. I've been working in this field for about 9 years, and I am also a licensed professional counselor within our community. So I'm really, really happy to be a part of this curriculum and to work so closely with Sonar, and I will pass it back to Naja.
Thank you, Ashante. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lindley Edges, the legal director of Transgender Law Center.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindley Edges. I'm the legal director at Transgender Law Center. Transgender Law Center is the largest national trans-led organization advocating for self-determination for all people. We're grounded in legal expertise and committed to racial justice. We employ a variety of community-driven strategies to keep transgender and gender non-conforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation. We focus on changing law, policy, and attitudes so that all people can live safely, authentically, and free from discrimination, regardless of their gender identity or gender expression. I have been at Transgender Law Center for almost 5 years now, and my background prior to coming to Transgender Law Center, I was the legal director at the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center, where I provided legal services to both sex workers and survivors of human trafficking. When I moved to Transgender Law Center, I shifted a little bit of our legal focus on to focus on transgender survivors of trafficking because of their underrepresentation in the field and the understanding of both law enforcement and organizations to see transgender people as possible survivors of trafficking. I've been in the anti-trafficking field for almost 15 years now, and I'm really, really excited about this curriculum and excited to speak to you today about some of my thoughts. And I will pass it back to Naja.
Thank you so much, Lindley. And finally, I will introduce Dr. Min Dang, who is the Executive Director of Survivor Alliance.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. My name is Min Dang and I am a co-founder and executive director of Survivor Alliance. We are an international nonprofit and our vision is a world where survivors are leading the anti-trafficking movement. We unite and empower survivors around the world. We are one of the few survivor-led organizations that bring survivors of all types of trafficking, all genders, all ethnicities, nationalities together, and we take an intersectional approach. Our focus is on leadership development, sustainable employment pathways, educating and training allies, and focusing on shifting the narrative in this sector so that we flip the status quo on its head and have survivors leading the agenda in policy, programming, and practice. I am a social worker, an educator by background. I did my PhD on studying survivor well-being, really seeing the need to shift towards a focus on well-being rather than a focus on psychopathology. And am a mother, a stepmom, and now live in the UK, but a life previous to moving here from the Bay Area in California, and really happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Min. Now we're going to go ahead and jump right into discussion with our subject matter experts and content contributors, starting with Kate Keisel. Oops.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Naja, Min, Lindley, Ashante. It is truly humbling to start to talk about the goals of the curriculum. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of what Sanar had hoped for at the beginning of this journey, there are a couple of things that I want to just take a moment to talk about. So one, I want to start by giving credit and honor where credit is due and acknowledge that individuals, organizations, and communities have long paved the way to wisdom of healing, to what it looks like to overcome trauma, and that we are simply working alongside with those individuals who are fostering pathways in ways that deserve recognition today. So for all of the individuals who participated in this content creation, for the countless individuals who build pathways forward in our communities, I want to extend my sincere gratitude and honor for being able to be here and speak a bit on behalf of that journey today. In addition, I would love to share a little bit about the iteration of how we came to create this training. Naja did a great job of talking about the background of what it looked like from a practical standpoint, what were some of those outcomes that we hoped. But at a really human level, this came from one of our founding goals as an organization. So prior to becoming a part of Project Trust, the Sanar Institute had worked since 2015 to create a curriculum that was a 3-day in-person training in addition to an iteration of a handbook called Building Healing Relationships. And that content was created with countless subject matter experts, clinicians, individuals with lived experience, survivor leaders, in addition to lots of different community members. And that really acted as the core content of much of what was built into this, the life that was built into this, and the labor of love, I think, for Sanara as a team, many of whom are here as participants today who utilize their own wisdom and also healing processes in creating this content. And building healing relationships was really designed with one goal in mind, and that was that so often we think about mental health care and trauma and healing as something that is really within the behavioral health institutions and areas, but that really one of the things that we could distill down and share and create empowerment-based practices was demystifying psychoeducation and the impacts of trauma for non-clinicians, but also firmly staying with a lens of post-traumatic growth, resilience, hope, and ensuring that we know what pathways there are towards healing. Because what we had seen time and time again at Sanara through our wellness and direct services was it frequently did not have anything to do with whether or not we knew how we move forward in the healing process, but had everything to do with access points. And access may mean that we do not have the resources for trauma-specific therapy or individualized modalities that feel closest to us or feel safe to us, that we don't have practitioners that are culturally responsive or understand the individual stories or that we or our communities have gone through. It may also mean that we don't have the geographic scope for this. So understanding how we can give individuals and communities back those tools that so often have been held within the behavioral health and mental health spaces. So from that, when we came into this project with USDRI and Brandeis University, one of the things that was a huge goal for us was creating a trauma literacy baseline. We recognize that for a long time, we've been talking about what trauma-informed practices mean, but not necessarily having a lot outside of the SAMHSA goals and things of that nature to guide those practices, or having a lot of different messaging about what that included. And that despite some of our best practices and hopes to moving towards this, that many individuals engaging in services still are reporting that they're not feeling supported in a person-centered, trauma-conscious, and culturally respectful manner. So our hope was to look at what does trauma do, what is the impact of trauma, and how this is truly a universal experience, that most of us are not lucky enough to get through this life course without experiencing our own lived experience with trauma, and that by understanding both our own trauma experiences and those of the individuals we serve that may have experienced trafficking situations, we can better respond, support, and move forward as a collaborative community looking to continue to grow. The next was really integrating a post-traumatic growth framework. So recognizing that we may experience trauma and that often in the conversation before that has been those of us with lived experience have a life sentence to our trauma legacy, but instead looking at what the knowledge and evidence shows, which is not only can we heal from trauma, but we can move well beyond what that looks like to become more connected, more meaningful, and more hopeful in the lives that we move. And the last was really to talk about what does it mean to move beyond trauma-informed. We heard so often in the feedback from participants that trauma-informed often was a breakout room in a conference, and we all seek to, build meaningful integration, but that sometimes that doesn't happen. And so our hope was to really build some additional language that was supportive for organizations, but also that it can be used for all of us with lived experience to go through and understand our own experiences and our own pathways to healing. Next slide, please, Naja. And the other place that I wanted to focus on are what were some of our outcomes or highlights, which is a really difficult thing to do. And I know we'll have some more additional time for questions and that some of the amazing panelists are already going to cover this. But we wanted to really look at what were those guideposts to change? What would it look like to implement some additional tools in a way that was no cost, that allowed different community members, stakeholders, and organizations to go through this content in a self-paced and self-timed manner while really creating those clear conversations for meaningful change. And part of that was convening this incredibly diverse group of stakeholders who led and participated in this content. I cannot thank Ashante, Lindley, Min, and additionally the Workers' Justice Center of New York, who are part of the content contributor team for the contributions that each of you gave as organizational leaders, but also as your collective wisdom, in addition to all of our pilot participants who provided invaluable feedback. and the team of individuals that are here today who have gone through the training and also see applications for the individuals in which you're working with. It is truly an honor. I am filled with gratitude and humility today, and I am very honored to pass it over to Ashante Taylor-Cox to talk about her experiences in both sharing content creation as a part of this curriculum and the ways in which hopefully this can support YAMT and their amazing change-making work.
Thank you. So YAMT, we contributed to the curriculum part of historical and intergenerational trauma. I started You Are More Than because I found that when it came to culturally specific spaces for trafficking survivors, it's very hard to find. And a lot of times folks, when talking about historical and intergenerational trauma, when talking about racial trauma, folks get scared. They don't know where to start. They don't know what types of trainings to take. They don't know what types of questions are appropriate to ask. They're not sure how to best support clients when it comes to this intersectionality of acknowledging our past traumas and interest in integrating them with our trafficking experiences. So we helped cultivate the historical and intergenerational trauma piece of this curriculum, particularly focusing on what can this look like for marginalized survivor communities and how does this impact us long-term. And then we also provided guidance throughout the curriculum on effective ways to cope and respond to trauma with clients across different systems of care. So whether you're a clinician walking into this space, a caseworker, legal support, housing manager, how can you support your client when they're sitting in front of you and they're struggling with a panic attack? They're struggling with being here present in the here and now. What types of tools, what real tools can I practice with them so that they can feel supported in this space? It's really, really important, I think, that throughout this curriculum that it's not just cultivated for one person. We're not just talking to clinicians do this work. We're talking to a diverse group of folks because you're going to interact with survivors throughout your spaces in different roles. And it's really important that, again, we're coming into this work at a baseline. We're all at an understanding. I want to echo what Kate said, but, you know, having this narrative that sometimes we all think we're trauma informed, which for the most part we are, but we all have our own narratives of what trauma informed means to us. Our organization might have values and trainings for trauma informed care. And then when we go out into the world and work with other organizations, they might have their own trauma trainings and things of that nature. And so we all are doing really, really great work, but we're not coming into this centralized, everyone has the same foundational knowledge, which this curriculum aims to do. Next slide, please. When it comes to YAMT, we want survivors to be able to go out into their community when accessing long-term supportive care and know that they're not going to be re-traumatized. Know that there are tools out in the community that are teaching the providers on how to be the best providers that they can be, and the survivors in the room are not teaching you. This curriculum really, really helps you understand, hey, this is what is being presented to me from the survivor's perspective, and this is how I can support, rather than a survivor coming into your room, sitting across from you and being the teacher, because that can be very, very draining. That can be hard, and it shouldn't happen. So within our mission, we want to create better aftercare services for survivors nationally, not only throughout New Jersey, but nationally. And this curriculum allows you to get your foot in the door to understand, okay, this is what intergenerational trauma looks like. This is what historical trauma looks like. This is what the biology of the brain, I didn't even know I needed to know about this in order to understand trauma. Okay, wow, this is what that looks like. This is how my experiences as a housing worker may look like when I'm coming into care with a survivor versus, hey, actually, I am a financial consultant and I want to help survivors become better entrepreneurs. This is what my role may look like in this space, and recognizing that we all play an important role in the work that we do with survivors, and being knowledgeable around how trauma impacts us can be really, really impactful. So the curriculum allows for stakeholders to, again, have this baseline standard of care. And maybe hopefully in the future, we have more of these trainings that expand on, okay, now we have this baseline. Now, where do we go next? Because once we're all at this same central space of being when working with our clients, we're only serving our clients better. We're only showing up for our clients in a more effective way. So I'm really, really happy to be a part of this curriculum and to bring this to the folks that we serve. At YMT, we have a directory and a therapy directory, and I see us being able to utilize this directory, this training with our directory providers as saying, okay, everyone takes this training and then we start the work. Here's our additional trainings. So I'm really, really happy to be a part of this curriculum and to have collaborated with SNAR and Project Trust in the amazing work that they're doing. And now I will pass it back to Naja.
Thank you.
Oh.
And now we're going to go ahead and transition over to Lindley Edges.
Thank you so much. So I talked already a little bit about Transgender Law Center, so I'm not going to go over the slides, not go over the content specifically on this slide again, but I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important, why TLC finds it so important to be part of the conversation around human trafficking. Over the past 13, 14 years, I've just noticed that transgender and LGBT people overall are just left out of the conversation around human trafficking. About, I don't know, I guess it was 13 years ago, I reached out to an assistant US attorney who focused all of her work on prosecuting human trafficking cases. And I said to her, I have a transgender client who is a survivor of human trafficking. And she said, I've never even heard of a transgender person being trafficked before. And she was an amazing AUSA, and she was doing her best. But because LGBTQ people are often left out of this conversation, it's important that we actually acknowledge that LGBT people can be trafficked and can have these experiences, and their voices should be heard when we are talking about curriculum and when we're talking about training. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is so incredibly important about this curriculum is honestly the content. I know it's already been said, but I've been looking for trainings that I can recommend to all of my colleagues that talk about trauma and talk about trauma in a way that not only explains what someone might be going through during an interview, but also providing tools and other tactics that can help support people during those interviews. And I've actually never seen curriculum like this before, because it really helps people move through those really difficult moments, and it doesn't leave both the providers or the person that provider is trying to help alone. It actually creates more of a situation where relationships can be built and trust can be built. The other thing that I really appreciate about this curriculum is the recognition of vicarious trauma and the need for providers to engage in self-care. For many people who've worked in the anti-trafficking field directly with survivors or are survivors themselves can know how the impact of working with people who've experienced so much trauma, or if they've experienced trauma themselves. And there often isn't a recognition that there is a need for self-care for everyone. And so I just really appreciated that in this curriculum. So I talked a little bit about why I think it's important for transgender people and lesbian, gay, bisexual people to be included when we're talking about human trafficking. And I want to just give a couple of examples of what we're actually seeing on the ground, because this is a curriculum that actually brings up the need to screen lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people for human trafficking. And what I'm seeing is, although there had been shifts a little bit over the last probably maybe 5 to 7 years ago to actually be more inclusive, we're actually seeing a shift away from that. So for example, we have a case right now where a person who was getting an order no order of protection against someone who was abusing her. No one screened her for trafficking, even though it was the person who was abusing her who called ICE on her and brought that person to court. And the federal government or the federal law enforcement actually chose not to screen her for human trafficking, and actually just decided to prosecute her for those crimes instead. And I've worked enough with law enforcement to know that if that person had been cisgender, she actually would have been screened appropriately. But because there is a lack of understanding, either intentional or unintentional, that person is now in jail for 9 years, despite the fact that she's a victim. So I think it's really important that that this curriculum actually highlights all different types of victims. The other thing I'm really excited about with this curriculum is that we have a project called our Border Butterflies Project, which provides both legal and social services and humanitarian services to asylum seekers, both in the United States and people who are coming into the United States through the US-Mexico border in San Ysidro. And a couple of years ago, right after we started that project, I was asked for curriculum literally exactly like this. And I went searching for it and there was nothing there. So I'm actually really excited that I can now say, hey, take a look. All of that information that you wanted on trauma, on how to work with people who've experienced trauma, is right there in one spot. And it is outstanding. It's really good. And that's why I'm just excited that I'm actually able to provide my colleagues with really good training instead of having to piecemeal something together, because that's what I was doing prior to this curriculum coming out. So just a little bit about why I'm excited and how I think this is going to have such a huge impact, not just on Transgender Law Center, not just on Border Butterflies Project, but on LGBT survivor communities in general, because it is an actual inclusive curriculum that's content is deliberate and intentional. And I think that has, from my experience, has been missing from the anti-trafficking field. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it back to Naja.
Thank you so much, Lindley. Now we're going to move ahead to Dr. Min Dang from Survivor Alliance.
Thanks so much. So we also, as everyone is echoing, are really glad to have contributed. So we helped with the trauma literacy core components. And I think one of the key things that Kate mentioned is that there's no baseline for the sector. And one of the things that we heard working and being connected with a lot of survivor leaders is that the folks that they are supported by in organizations say that they are trauma informed, but don't really know what that means. And I'm really excited that we got to share how Survivor Alliance approaches trauma. They are based in narrative approaches, but also, as was mentioned, that this curriculum is for people who might not be psychological or from a mental health background, that whether or not we are providing mental health services, having a basic trauma literacy is important for everyone in the sector. So I think that this is really accessible, goes over key trauma vocabulary so we can all stop just throwing words around and really being clear with our language. And an overview of the various impacts of trauma. And I think what's important about this is that we think about impacts of trauma that are beyond the traditional ones that you hear about that cause, diagnosable mental illness or mental health diagnoses. So there's a wider spectrum of trauma impacts. We also talked about survivor-informed, in-person centered practices. I think one of the key things is to understand that as a practitioner, survivor-informed practices don't just mean asking your client what they're interested in. That's just good client practice. But so being survivor-informed includes having survivor leader experts who have provided direct services input into your programming. So we share a bit about what it means and how it can look for your organization to have survivor leaders review the way that you provide services. We also make sure that we talk about meeting ethical standards of care. I think one of the challenging pieces of having a lot of services being provided by nonprofits and having services across the United States is that there isn't a regulation body, right? All hospitals, you meet certain standards. And what we've included in this is a standards that we could set ourselves to be accountable for, even if, there is no accountability body externally. So then the last piece is really integrating survivor-led engagement skills. So to be very careful that survivor engagement, when you are also the service provider, is really different from including survivor leaders from outside of your organization. So we do provide some guidelines on how to work with diverse survivor leaders and working with communities most impacted by this. So thinking about survivor leaders as your colleagues rather than service recipients, and providing you some practical tools for doing that. Next slide, please. And for us as an organization, we're really happy about this curriculum because it expands access and capacity training for survivor leaders. Not all survivor leaders have the ability to gain training through formal educational institutions. And so for us, we really want to promote survivor leaders becoming practitioners. In one of our leadership programs, one of the tracks that people can take is about becoming trauma-informed direct service providers. So this curriculum will actually help us provide training and support for more survivor leaders, but also allow us to focus on the uniqueness of being a survivor leader practitioner. So we're really excited about that, and the accessibility, not just that it's free and online, but that the language is more accessible to people who don't have higher degrees. And then expanding capacity and access to training for allies. So we have a lot of allies who reach out to us about survivor engagement. And one of the things that we often say in our training is that having a baseline of trauma literacy is really important, and we can't provide all of that. And so it'd be really great for us to point allies to this training, and for us to refer them to resources that they can use to train their staff team. So hopefully this increases the overall knowledge that practitioners bring when they want to work with survivor leaders, because coming from a trauma-informed, person-centered lens is very important if you're going to incorporate survivor leaders as colleagues, professionals, and leaders of the anti-trafficking movement. So for us, it's a wonderful resource that we can refer people to, and like everyone else, super happy to answer questions about our contributions and about our organization. So actually I'm finishing, so turning it back to you, Naja.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists who are talking about their subject matter expertise and their contribution. Now we're going to transition into a brief Q&A with our panelists, where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into their contribution and their overall feedback on the curriculum. So first, I'm going to pose this question to Kate. And the first question is, what were the most exciting parts of the curriculum that will support your work?
Naja, thank you so much for the question. I've been sitting here pondering on those pieces, and I think it's difficult whenever I hear most, I then get really, I feel like I've got to have the right answer. So I think actually my answer for this is, what is most exciting for me is this being just the beginning. I think that my fellow colleagues on the panel today have highlighted that this baseline is very important. I think also SENAT as an organization, and I think collectively the subject matter experts who have come in to participate in this creation, Min, Lindley, Ashante, Workers Justice Center, as well as all of our pilot participants have acknowledged that there's more work to be done. So what I'm excited for are further iterations of additional training that can help us dive deeper collectively and to recognize that when we're talking about trauma and trauma conscious work and person-centered work, that we're talking about real people, real people's lives, and we're not just talking about sensationalizing trauma narratives. So the ability to have a baseline understanding of language that we can then move forward to as a field that truly understands the impact of trauma, and then that we can move forward and have additional trainings at deeper levels that can support what really healing and resiliency entails. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm going to turn over to Ashante and ask the same question. What's the most exciting part of the curriculum for your work and the work of You Are More Than?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned this a few minutes ago in my presentation, but YAMT runs a mental health directory, and oftentimes we have therapists who may have been doing this work for a really, really long time, or they are just new to the field and want to be able to understand trafficking and what it can look like to do this work in a clinical setting. And so I'm really excited about having this baseline support for them to be able to learn from all of us and utilize this work when working with clients. I love the different modules, particularly the self-care module. And I really, really just love to kind of piggyback off of what Lindley was saying about supports for LGBTQ plus survivors. Because our work focuses on BIPOC and LGBTQ plus folks, I think like more curriculum that has knowledge about our specialized communities and being able to better support us is just going to make for a better world. So that really excites me about this curriculum, and really excited for folks to learn from us through this curriculum.
Thank you so much, Ashante. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second question for Lindley. So Lindley, how do you envision utilizing this resource for continued education within your agency and with the agencies that you partner with?
I just want to answer the first question just really quick.
Sure.
Because I think this is really important. One of the things I really love about this curriculum is even after doing this work for almost 15 years, I learned something, and I learned a lot. And it was interesting and kept my attention in a way that I actually wanted to continue with it. And I think that sometimes in some curriculums in the anti-trafficking world and in other worlds, the content doesn't always keep you as interested and engaged. And sometimes if you've been doing this work for a while, it feels like you're looking for part 2, part 5, part 10. And I feel like this curriculum actually allows for people of all different levels of experience to gain information and knowledge. So I really want to highlight that, as well as the fact that you actually want to listen and you actually want to continue, because it is, the way it is framed is quite engaging. I look forward to being able to share this curriculum with not just the people I work with, but I get a lot of random requests for curriculum and to learn more. As I said, I continue to work on cases of transgender people being trafficked, and I don't always get the best feedback or responses, I should say, excuse me, from people who in theory should be helping survivors of trafficking. So I would love to be able to provide them with this training for them to learn more, not just about being trauma informed, although that is important and that is missing too, but about the different communities that experience human trafficking.
Thank you so much, Lindley. And as someone who narrated this curriculum several times, I am very pleased to hear that it was engaging and kept you focused on the material. And so now I'm going to move ahead to posing the same question to Dr. Min Dang. What were the most exciting parts of the curriculum that supports your work?
Oh, similar to Kate, I can't really say a most exciting. Yeah, and I don't want to just say the parts that we contributed. So, I think that the neurobiology pieces were really provided in a way that helps people of all walks of life to understand. And for me, it's it's widespread, I think, knowledge in lots of sectors, but I think helping people understand that trauma is not personal in some ways. It's personal because it affects each of us, but also how it affects our physiology allows for a conversation about the mind, body, brain connections. And so that we move beyond just thinking that these are psychological symptoms, but that we are whole people, and different elements of ourselves are being impacted by this trauma. So, and then similar, I'm so glad that there's been so much different lived experience expertise in this curriculum, and that folks who tend to be excluded are really seen in it. And yeah, I think that's the best you're going to get out of me today. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Min. You all have really answered some of these questions already in your presentations. What stood out the most, which is that most of it is so new, and how it can be used with not just your organization, but all of our partner organizations to really ensure that this becomes a standard in the field. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward, and we're going to jump right on into panel 2. So now we're going to jump into the application of the curriculum. So for folks who did not contribute to the curriculum, how can this be used in a way that's going to be beneficial to our mission of disrupting and ending trafficking, as well as responding to and providing trauma-conscious services to individuals in need? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition to our subject matter experts. First, we have Laura Revercombe. Laura is a human rights attorney with over 18 years of experience in labor and employment law, with a particular focus in the last 6 years on labor trafficking and sexual violence in the workplace. Laura is a member of the Capital Region Anti-Trafficking Task Force in Albany, New York, and serves as Human Rights Commissioner for the City of Kingston, New York. Laura is also a member of the Speakers Bureau for Freedom Network USA, the largest coalition of experts and advocates in the US, of providing a human rights-based approach to fighting human trafficking. Laura's legal work serving individuals who have experienced labor trafficking, previous work as a social worker for children who experience violence and abuse, her research background at Cornell University focused on qualitative interviews and empirical research in metacognition, memory, and the validity of eyewitness testimony, as well as her own lived experience, provide a solid foundation for public interest legal work and the delivery of trauma-informed care. You'll hear more from Laura in a moment once we get to her slides. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shobana Powell.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Shobana Powell. I am the CEO and founder of SPC, Shobana Powell Consulting. And what we do is national training and technical assistance on specifically human trafficking and trauma from an anti-oppressive lens. So working with nonprofits and government agencies around the country, really specific to program design and building trainings and curriculums, building new programs, all that fun stuff. I have the pleasure of getting to, through this work, partner with survivor and lived experience experts around the country. And that's kind of how we do what we do. And we're pretty much known for 3 key areas. We focus on survivor equity and inclusion, so how to work with survivors in the movement in equitable ways rather than re-exploiting folks. Vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience, taking care of those who do this work, whether or not we are survivors, whether or not we openly identify as survivors in the workplace. And then also psychological coercion and understanding the nuances and subtleties of trafficking and how it often goes unidentified because we're often looking for the wrong things or missing the realities of it. And in terms of my work, my background is as a clinical social worker. I've been a trauma therapist, done forensic mental health and sex trafficking evaluations, and done a lot of program design, ran a survivor leadership program, and a flexible funding cash assistance program, lots of different things. But very, very grateful to be here today with such a stellar panel of folks and excited about this curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shobana. And now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Crystal Mills, the victim specialist at the FBI.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So again, Crystal Mills, I'm the victim specialist for the FBI in Los Angeles. I've been with the Bureau for almost 8 years now, and my job really is I'm responsible for coordinating services to all victims of federal crimes, including human trafficking, of course, kidnapping, crimes against children, cyber crimes, among others, including mass casualty, hate crimes. I also participate in a lot of the task force meetings, community outreach, and I do trainings internally and externally. I am on call 24/7, and I help with victim recovery operations and mass casualty incidents. Prior to joining the Bureau, I used to work for Polaris Project in New Jersey as a senior case manager for about 6 years. And my background, my education is I have a bachelor's of science in criminology and a master's of arts in international affairs with a focus on human rights. I am a fluent Spanish speaker, and I'm an immigrant, a new mom, and I'm really, really excited to be here. Thank you, and I pass it on to Karen.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I will go ahead and introduce Karen Romero. She is the Senior Director of Training at Freedom Network USA. The Training Institute develops and delivers high-quality training and technical assistance to anti-trafficking programs in allied fields. She's a native Spanish speaker who worked with survivors of sexual assault as a bilingual therapist at Utah's Rape Recovery Center, where she was trained in EMDR. She went on to direct the YWCA, Utah Domestic Violence Shelter, and oversaw a team of case managers, as well as provided therapy to survivors of domestic violence. Later, she served as a social services director for Ayuda, an NGO based in Washington, D.C., serving survivors of trafficking, domestic violence, and unaccompanied minors. Most recently, Godin worked at Polaris as a training and survivor services manager. Godin received her master's degree in psychology from the University of Utah. So now I'm going to go ahead and move forward, and Laura is going to lead us through her slides.
Thank you, Naja. First and foremost, I just want to thank the Sonar Institute, Project Trust, and everyone involved with creating this amazing curriculum. It really elevates the topic of trauma-informed engagement to the next level, and I was really honored to be a part of this process. So one of the first things that I was asked to consider is really how this curriculum could be used in my role as an attorney working with individuals who have been trafficked or experienced trauma. And I think one of the primary ways that I would use it is really to encourage other attorneys to review the material, to do the training, and really engage with and reflect on the material. Because what I think it did in a very significant and powerful way is expand our collective view of what should or could be included within an attorney-client relationship. And this really connects to the stigma that the curriculum talks about that is often attached to trauma-informed engagement for attorneys. Specifically that this is not, quote, real legal work if you engage in this kind of work. And I think what this curriculum did in a very successful way is establish that trauma-informed engagement is not only real legal work, but it is a critical component of legal work, especially when you're representing clients who've experienced trauma, because it's a critical component of establishing trust with that client. And trust is important in any relationship, but very, very important in the attorney-client relationship. And it's really the foundation of trust that creates the better engagement and ultimately better client care. And I thought that the curriculum just did an amazing job at explaining that. And in that sense, this is really, to me, an incredible opportunity for self-reflection and professional growth for attorneys, really, regardless of their area of practice. And one of my, I guess, personal hopes is that this curriculum can be inserted in an intentional way into law school curriculum, into mentorships, into legal internships, into any sort of training where we're educating legal professionals and especially attorneys in this country. The next slide. And the second thing I was asked to consider were the parts of the training that I feel were most important to implement for best practices in anti-trafficking work. And I definitely would highlight neurobiology of trauma. I think that's really critical for attorneys, and especially attorneys who often engage with law enforcement, specifically because it really lays out in such a clear, concise way why the memories associated with trauma may not be formed in a chronological way, in a linear way that a lot of attorneys and law enforcement will demand and kind of expect. And I just thought that that was a really, really important part of the training. And also cultural humility. So just creating, again, that greater self-awareness on the part of the attorney that really leads to better client care. And meeting your client where they are, even when it's inconvenient. So I say inconvenient because this really has to do with time management. And attorneys often have, a million different deadlines. And I think how I would use this training and how I have used it is to really make sure that I am inserting enough time for my clients and preparing them for what can be a really stressful situation. So whether that's a deposition or testifying in court or something like that. So where you may normally have a week to prepare, maybe you need a month, just to make sure that if your client is just having a day where they're not prepared to engage, that you still have enough time. Also self-blame. I think self-blame can come up in the attorney-client relationship, especially with those that have experienced trauma in multiple instances of trauma. And I think as long as we can identify it, then we know how to work with it. And this curriculum, again, did an amazing job of explaining that and how to deal with it in your client services. And then last but not least, which is kind of funny because I think I'm out of time, but is creating space and time for trauma-informed engagement, because it absolutely takes more time, but it is absolutely worth it. Thank you so much. And I will, I believe, pass it back to Naja.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura, for that brief overview of how this can be applied within attorney-client relationships. Now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Shobana Powell to really talk us through how this can be applied in survivor-centered relationships.
Excuse me. Thank you, Naja. So I talked a little bit about what we do at Shobana Powell Consulting. We really focus our work on serving historically marginalized and oppressed communities. So we really focus on how trafficking and trauma impact BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and immigrant communities. And a new piece of what we do is also trauma-informed interpretation and translation, just because we found as we're doing this culturally inclusive work, there's a missing piece of making sure that the interpretation or translation is actually trauma-informed. So we've been building that out on our team as well. Next slide, please. Great. So a little bit of some of my thoughts about this curriculum. I think we've been all talking about this, that 10 hours does not make someone an anti-trafficking or trauma expert, but it is a great baseline. It's a powerful start. I think going into this, that's so important to know because most of us have been doing this for a really long time. It took us much more than 10 hours to get to where we are. So no one's going to come out of this understanding everything about trauma, but it helps a lot to have this baseline. I remember I, early in my career, tried to do a 101 on trafficking, you know, one of those 60 minutes. And somebody left the training asking, oh, well, you mentioned like trauma and you kind of mentioned PTSD. Can children have PTSD if they haven't been to war? And I was like, oh no, I have failed. In like, I just did 60 minutes on trafficking and we never understood that what child trauma even is, or even adult trauma. So I appreciate that it really starts on this foundational knowledge of what is trauma before we move to understanding trafficking, and it combines the two. And then one thing I really love is that, you know, we've been talking about it's co-created with folks with lived experience and diverse folks with lived experience. That makes a big difference because for me, I highly recommend if you are going to recommend this training to others, you review it yourself and make sure that it fits your values. I'm very, maybe y'all can psychoanalyze me. I don't trust easily, so I don't just send around this type of training without having reviewed it myself. And so I recommend you do the same. But what I love about it is that it does fit my values really well. It really focuses on being built in partnership with folks with lived experience. It's both scientific and culturally inclusive, which like those two things are not the opposite. So it talks about systemic oppression. It also talks about traditional evidence-based therapies, as well as alternative therapies like trauma-sensitive yoga, art, music, dance. I love that. It also focuses on vicarious trauma and self-care. It has content warnings throughout each portion, which I'm stealing in my own training. We usually do a content warning at the beginning. Now I'm doing content warnings throughout because you might need a reminder that you are a human being, and going through 10 hours of training or any amount of training on trauma is heavy, and that's okay. And then I love that it's strengths-based. It really focuses on resilience and post-traumatic growth. And like folks have been saying, even the images are not sensationalizing. They're really focused on seeing survivors also as human beings who are complex and not just defined by their trauma. So that's kind of my overview, some of my initial thoughts. And then for the application, I think this is great for building confidence. What I see a lot in the field is a lot of separations between who is an anti-trafficking expert and who is not, and then this fear that I haven't received enough training, so I can't help. And I see that a lot working with DV and sexual assault advocates, especially. And I'm like, no, you do know what you're doing. But I would love to be able to send folks to take this training on their own time, self-paced, to build that confidence and let them know, like, see, you went through 10 hours of training and you do know this stuff. Hopefully you learned more, but hopefully it also made you realize that you can work with survivors and you don't have to be afraid. We need you. I think the same for law enforcement, for probation, also school staff, or new staff on your own teams. I've done some trafficking trainings with school districts for teachers, for custodians, bus drivers, and them receiving that kind of training helped identify survivors that wouldn't have been identified before. Also, a really big one that I see as an application for this is trauma-informed alternative healing. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we only have like traditional trauma therapy, which I'm a trauma therapist. I love that, but not everyone is ready for that. Maybe that's not a good fit for everyone. Maybe it's not always culturally inclusive. What if there's someone who teaches an African dance class but they don't know maybe that much about trauma or trafficking? I always want to partner with someone like that, and then I end up having to do the training, which takes a ton of time. How amazing if I could just say, hey, I know you want to work with the survivors I work with and you want to do it well. Here's this training you can do for free on your own time, and it'll help build you up so you feel confident that you're not causing harm. And I'm definitely going to be using it in that way because there's all these creative ways we could be engaging with the community. And the reasons I think we don't is fear of causing harm, lack of training, but now we have this resource. And I also think it's useful for volunteers you may work with, and also for clinicians, even for myself. It made me feel great. I was worried, like, do I know about neurobiology? Am I doing my historical and intergenerational trauma work well? And then attending this training, knowing it was built by survivors, lived experience experts, and anti-trafficking clinicians, I was like, okay, yeah, no, I do know what I'm talking about. So I recommend it, I think, across the board, no matter what level of anti-trafficking or trauma expertise you have. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Naja.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. I'm going to go ahead and move ahead to Crystal Mills.
Hello again. Thank you so much. So again, the victim, a lot of people, I think some people don't even know that the FBI has a victim services program. So I'm always excited to talk about the program and the work that we do. The victim services program at the FBI was established in 2001. And since then, it had really grown tremendously. There are 172 victim specialists nationwide, covering 56 different field offices, including Indian Territory. And the FBI victim specialists play a really unique role because our responsibility is to maintain the integrity of the investigation while also ensuring that victims' rights and services are afforded. And I talked a little bit about the different violations that I cover personally, but also I'm going to go a little more in depth about what a VS, and we use a lot of acronyms at the FBI and government work, what we do. So our main role really is to assess the needs of victims during an FBI investigation. Typically from the very beginning of the investigation, we partner up with the agent and we get to learn a little bit about the case, but more particularly about the needs of the victim. And so we do some of the general assessments of emergency needs versus long-term needs, so shelter, mental health, medical, maybe it's a forensic sexual assault exam, dental education, job, transportation, food, clothing, immigration attorneys, for example, among many others. And each case is very different. Each client is very different. This also reminds me of a quick disclosure that I want to make. I will use the term victim, survivor interchangeably. Obviously, in our field of work, we use the term victim most of the time simply because my title says victim specialist. And in the criminal justice system, that term is what is typically used in documentation in court and things like that. But I am fully aware that it is not a term that people want to hear. I would not want to be called a victim. I'm very mindful of that. So when I work with clients, I try to not use that term, but I do educate them that in this role, in this paperwork that you're completing or this compensation documentation, you're considered the victim, but I'm aware that is not something that you want to hear. And so I am very mindful of that. So going back to a little bit of the work we do. So my main role is to also notify victims of their rights and their services that they're entitled to, any state compensation that's available for them, resources, coordinating these resources, crisis intervention in both like individually with the client who's maybe not having a lot of fear and anxiety and explaining the criminal justice system, but also in terms of operations. We do a lot of different operations, search warrants, arrest warrants. And if there are victims in the house when that's taking place, or if there are children in the house when that's taking place, then I come in on board and I'm along with, if there's children involved, then we'll have CPS with us to assist in that as well. We work in collaboration with a variety of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies as well. And then we act as a liaison between the victim and the agent so that the victim is getting all their answers, all their questions answered, they're understanding what role they play, they're updated on specific updates. We can't tell them everything, but the main ones that they're entitled to are, if there's an arrest, an indictment, any court proceedings, and I coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office, victim specialists as well. We talked about victim impact statement, restitution, and things like that. And we also collaborate, like I mentioned, with CPS, nonprofit organizations, and community organizations to ensure that the survivors, the clients are getting all their services, all their needs met by these service providers. And it's important to do it proactively. So when the case comes to you, you know where to go for these services. In addition, we also have a very amazing unit within Victim Services at headquarters that helps victims of child sexual abuse material. Previously, the term was used child pornography. We are staying away from that term. And so any CSAM cases that have been any victims that have been identified from CSAM cases, then we will also identify them, step one, and then also provide services for them. So that's a very quick glimpse of what victim services at FBI does. There's a lot more there, but for the sake of time, I'll move on to the next slide. So I read this curriculum. It's extremely long. It's amazing. I was very excited as I went through each slide. I was like, yep, There's a lot of that going on. So it's great. It's very comprehensive. It talks about a lot of different things that would be so beneficial. For the purposes, and first of all, I want to just say thank you for inviting me to participate in this, because I think it would be a disservice to not include law enforcement, particularly advocates, to the conversation, because ultimately will benefit the survivors, the clients that we work with. So the main benefit that I see here, how it would be utilized, is to reduce the potential of trauma to victims that may result from contact within the criminal justice system. We all know that the criminal justice system is not perfect. It's complicated, it's scary, it's complex. And so by training staff, anyone, advocates, law enforcement officials within the criminal justice system, would just help get victims to not be traumatized as much, I would say. And then also, oftentimes victims don't report the crime. So I think it would also increase the number of individuals that come forward and report a crime. A lot of the work that I do is to speak in, I do a lot of presentations to our Latino community in Spanish so that they understand what their rights are. And so in doing so, because I'm aware of the fear factor there, there's no denying that. And so also I think it would help victims who have already been identified of some victimization to prevent re-victimization. And you guys know more that, understand that this happens all the time. I also think that understanding trauma particularly will help all victim cases, not only human trafficking cases. Sometimes we talk about human trafficking, but they're also victims of other crimes. And so I think it's just a win-win situation by having law enforcement, both advocates and agents or investigators, understand trauma a little bit more in depth would be super beneficial. So again, training tool for agents and victim specialists, it's just, there's nothing but benefits from that. There are victim specialists that, most victim specialists have extensive training and experience with trauma from their previous jobs. Some are newer victim specialists, so I think they would benefit as well. Some VSs have been doing this for a very long time and they need a refresher, right? And then also agents. I think as a victim specialist, I know they listen to us, they trust us, and we serve kind of like the best practices liaison advocate within the agency to promote this material. And we would recommend this to our partner agencies. We work with so many agencies, CPS, local law enforcement, task force officers that come from local departments to come work for the FBI as a liaison, prosecutors, attorneys. Again, like I mentioned, I work with a lot of immigration attorneys, and I think that would be beneficial. And lastly, which also I'm very excited because I participated, I do a lot of trainings, but I participated or sat in a training last week, the National Self-Care Conference for Anti-Violence Advocates. And one of the things I noticed, not only from that training, but just the work that I do in the last 2 to 3 years, advocates, law enforcement, they're burnt out. They are themselves suffering from secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Everybody's exhausted. There's so much happening in this world, in this country, with the mass casualty incidents, with the cases that they work. And I think that the trauma training and also the self-care aspects of it would be so helpful for the staff that are doing the work on the field directly with clients. So I'm very excited. Thank you for inviting me. I think this is beneficial for everyone. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And with that, we're going to turn it over to our final panelist, Karen Romero from Freedom Network USA.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit about my experience with you all. So a little background on Freedom Network. We are a national membership or a coalition of 91 organizations and individuals throughout the US. So we are primarily made up of direct service providers, survivor leaders, researchers, everyone who is really working towards addressing human trafficking based on a rights-based approach. And so when we're talking about rights and human rights, we're really talking about things that really fuel human trafficking in those root causes. And so thinking about how systemic oppression, how racism and sexism and homophobia really marginalize communities and make them more susceptible to being exploited, or in that's including human trafficking. And so within the network, we really look to each other to be a learning community, to support each other in ensuring that we're all addressing human trafficking and providing services through high quality, but also through evidence and best practices. And so that's a really critical component of the network. Within that, having values that prioritize self-determination, choice, and person-centered support for all survivors is very critical, and that we're really looking at the whole landscape of human trafficking. Oftentimes, I'm sure in the experience of many of the previous presenters that just spoke, and also of those listening in, there are certain communities and even within human trafficking, labor trafficking survivors are often left out and excluded. And so we've tried to be very intentional about ensuring that services are available to all, and that they are not just accessible, but equitable in that way. And so that means, really looking at our network as how we're actively practicing our values, and, really looking at how we're ensuring that we're creating equity and also becoming an anti-racist organization. So all of these things are very critical to the work that we do, and they are a foundation of the network that we are. So I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit about how we saw, how I particularly was able to experience this curriculum, which I was very excited to be able to be a part of reviewing and just learning a little bit more about. So in my work, previously as a direct service provider, I always saw a need for training. And I think in one, being a direct service provider who was working with survivors one-on-one, but also in managing therapists and case managers and advocates, I think there's always a need for training. And sometimes as direct service organizations, we may be limited both in funding, but even in resources that are not fund related, right? So even in the types of trainings that we do have available within our disposal, within our reach, to provide to service providers, to the advocates, to the case managers, to the therapists. And I think additionally, sometimes, at least I have experienced it personally, it can be very awkward, or it can feel a little intimidating to request training materials, because it feels like we should know all the information, even when we have not been provided all the information. And all to say that I don't think anybody knows every single thing, but it is very nice to have a resource that can support that foundation and give you the different components to really further a trauma-centered and trauma-responsive work, really, in services. And so I can see this being really useful for direct service providers, for people in the anti-trafficking field with allied fields, in providing that context and background for that intersection of trauma and service provision. I think it feels very, as I was going through it, it felt very comprehensive. It definitely, as Crystal was saying, if it is long, right? So I think that is one consideration to really keep in mind about it with any training, really giving it the time and care in order to obtain as much and retain knowledge from it. And I think that's one of the nice pieces of this curriculum, is that it also helps with retention of information and knowledge, that, and also just applying it to the day-to-day practice of trauma-informed care. So I believe a few of my previous presenters had mentioned this, but sometimes there is a gap between the theory of trauma-informed services or trauma-responsive services and the practice of it. And I feel like this curriculum has really been able to navigate bridging those two and providing some practical examples about how to apply what you just learned. Another piece is really the centering of diverse communities within that trauma responsive approach, and thinking about how those diverse communities are experiencing the trauma, how we as service providers can ensure that we're not contributing to re-traumatization, and really focusing on how we can meet people where they're at, which is central to trauma-informed responsive care, and also something that, when we get into the day-to-day work, it can sometimes kind of be put in the back burner. And so I really enjoyed the practice and implementation pointers. I think that for me has been critical in really, again, putting into practice the knowledge that we have received from any training, right? I think that that's what's really critical. It's really helpful to have the knowledge and the theory, but for me, especially when I was practicing, is how do I, as a practitioner in any level, right, as an advocate, case manager, therapist, someone in management, in administration, how do we apply these pieces so that way the survivors that we're serving are really seeing this trickle down, it is informing and it is enhancing our approach to service delivery. And so I really see this training as a professional development resource that can be utilized throughout the organization in all the different levels, because it's useful information, it's practical, and it can really, I think, go a long way. And so I'm really excited to see, what the experience of other providers in the field are, because I feel like it's going to be a really meaningful resource. And that's my time. So I'm going to pass it back. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gaden. Now we're going to move ahead into Q&A with panel 2. So the first question is going to be posed to Laura. What principles learned from the curriculum have been most impactful for your work, or would be most impactful?
I feel like I have to mention two, and the first one would just be this sort of new, based on the curriculum, fresh and modern view of the attorney-client relationship, and really establishing that trust and the work and the time that has to go into doing that, just like you would with any relationship. I was just so grateful for the amount of work that was put into that part of the curriculum. And then the other part are the coping strategies. For example, there was this 5-4-3-2-1 technique, or the COPE, COPE. And for me, especially during the pandemic, sometimes there were moments where I couldn't be in the same physical space as my client. So when I saw this in the curriculum, there was just, I felt like it was putting a number of new resources and tools in my toolbox for situations like that, when maybe you can't be in the same physical space. And I just thought that was amazing. And I have to say that the butterfly hug was one of my most favorite things of the whole curriculum.
Thank you so much, Laura. I also love the butterfly hug and often share it in my trainings. And the same question is going to be proposed to Dr. Shobana Powell. What principles learned from the curriculum would be or have been the most impactful in your work?
Yeah, so I really appreciated the section on historical and intergenerational trauma, and specifically how it's only a couple slides. I know we've all been talking about it, but it's not that in depth because this is a baseline training and there's so much further we could go. But it's also something people rarely talk about in the movement, or if they do, it's like a bullet point, or all of our communities are bulked together into one slide. So at least here, there's, I think, maybe 3 or 4 slides, and it separates out the difference between, or the unique experiences of the Black community and historical intergenerational trauma. And then separately, the immigrant community, as well as the intersections and overlaps. And then lastly, the LGBTQ plus community and folks who might fall under all of those. But I just really appreciate that it breaks it down and doesn't lump us all together, because that's much more culturally inclusive. I also just wanted to note that it's only a couple slides, and I feel like we've all been like not fangirling, but fan individualing around it, but I think it's because it's just been missing in the movement, and it at least is a start. So I would say that's something that really stood out to me.
Thank you so much, Shobana. Yes, we at SANAR and within Project Trust were very adamant about including at least like a foundation to understanding some of those things. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And so now I'm going to move on to the same question to Crystal. What principles learned from the curriculum have been or would be most impactful in your work?
I have a long list, so I'm gonna stick to the main ones.
Okay.
The neurobiology of trauma, of course, I like that it points that it's a universal human experience. I think that highlighting that with law enforcement can bridge that gap of like us versus them. Like we all suffer trauma at some point in our life, probably different trauma, but seeing it from that perspective, I think it's useful. I think the support versus sensationalizing trauma is also super important within law enforcement. The fear explanation by Mary Vicario was really useful, I think, especially within law enforcement, the criminal justice system, understanding that, like, how do you get the thinking brain to talk to the fear brain? Post-traumatic growth, critical. Just because you've gone through trauma doesn't mean that you're broken and that's it, that's the end of you. It's seeing that there's more to the person than just the trauma. I'm also really excited and happy because I think this is the first time I've seen this within the anti-trafficking world, that they talk about historical trauma and intergeneration. Well, I've seen intergenerational trauma, but historical trauma, I think it's really important that you cannot ignore those aspects, and it does cause a lot of isolation to the population in accessing social services and also trusting law enforcement. And then the the person-centered engagement, of course, like some of the communication skills that you can use of safety first, mirroring. And then the last piece, which I think I talked about in my PowerPoint slide, the vicarious trauma and self-care. I loved it. It's so important. Everybody needs it because I do think that advocates not only in the anti-trafficking field, but all violence, anything, really suffer in silence, and nobody wants to talk about their own pain and the burnout and all the stuff that they're dealing with. So I like that mini wellness assessment and the emergency self-care plan and boundaries. I'm a huge fan of boundaries. So anyways, that's
absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, and the next question is going to be for Karen. Karen, how do you foresee other stakeholders in your agency or the agencies that Freedom Network partners with using this curriculum? And I think you spoke a little bit about it already.
Yeah, for sure. So, as a network of service providers, which is very diverse, right? So we have service providers that focus on various populations, many who are programs that are based on larger settings, right? So they're not specific anti-trafficking organizations, but they might be a program within that larger setting. So I think they're having that ability to have that, again, this tool in providing the context for, I really enjoyed the historical and cultural trauma. I'm thinking about the physical impacts of trauma. I think just the diversity that we have based on our disciplines, but also based on the type of work that that the network members are engaging in. I think that can that can provide you just in your own discipline or in your own role, different training opportunities. And this feels like it can really be beneficial to all, right? So I was thinking about some of the activities that the previous panelists mentioned, the butterfly hug and other things, where I was like, oh yeah, those were things that I had the opportunity to be trained on as a therapist, back in the day, where I was like, oh yeah, these are not just wonderful tools, but they're very applicable and practical tools that can be utilized by a wide range of different, individuals that are working in this movement. And so I can see that being part of, those tools and that set of tools that can be at their disposal, especially for somebody that, within our network that is such a wide array of disciplines, but also, in the way that they practice and in the roles that they hold.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. So now we're going to go ahead and move on, unless any of the panelists have anything additional to add to any of these questions that have already been posed. Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. And this is the part where we get to tell you how to access the curriculum now that you all know what the curriculum is about and how it can be used. So the full curriculum and its accompanying resources can be found by visiting Sanad Institute's website at the site on your screen. When you get to the home page of our newly released website, you can click on Training Portal up in the blue ribbon. And from there, you should enter the information that's noted. So the information that is on the first screenshot on your screen. Once you submit that information, it will take you directly into our training portal where you will see, once you scroll down, the bottom picture, which is a snapshot of the training itself. Please note that when you do visit the training portal, it is very likely that the audio narration will start. So you can always pause it or skip through to whatever section you need to. And in addition to the curriculum itself, most modules include accompanying handout resources that you will need in order to move through the curriculum. And so you can always download those resources or print them if you'd like so that you can have them. But they are all going to be on Sanar's training portal. And once you complete the curriculum, there are also additional Project Trust webinars that have been pre-recorded that you can use for continued learning. Here you can find webinar topics such as legal engagement or trauma-conscious legal engagement, person-centered practices, boundaries, a whole host of things that can supplement your learning. And also, please note, you can also access the curriculum and these resources on USCRI's website in their training portal as well. And so finally, I want to share a couple of tips and tricks to help you all maximize the effectiveness of this curriculum. The curriculum is self-paced, so that means that you do not have to rush through it. The topics, as have been noted by our panelists, can be quite dense and they require your full attention. So we recommend that you pause as needed, take breaks, step away, and come back to it with a fresh mind and fresh eyes. Be sure to slow down at the reflection activities and really take time to think about your answers or the application of these principles as they pertain to your specific role. This curriculum is broad and general enough where we can each look at it from the lens of our role. So please make sure that you take some time to think through that. And as noted on the previous slide, be sure to pair lessons with the corresponding handouts. You can find those handouts by scrolling down past the curriculum on the Sanar training portal. And finally, you will notice, or not finally, you will also notice on some of the slides in the curriculum itself, there are little information icons in the top right or top left of each of the slide. These icons provide additional examples or tips for applying principles or to further illustrate the point of a specific slide or topic. Each information icon will cover application for one of 4 subjects: lived experience integration, organizational leadership, trauma-conscious service delivery, or vicarious trauma. And so there you will find some different tips and tricks on how to implement things or further examples as they apply to one of the 4 buckets. And finally, we want to make sure that we are also exploring the supplemental resources at the end of each module. As I noted previously, this is a foundational resource. So in order to supplement some of the topics that are in the curriculum, such as intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, we have included a combination of resources such as videos, podcasts, articles, and books to further explore those topics so that we can each enhance our own understanding. And so with that, that brings us to our participant Q&A. If you have any questions about the curriculum, about the topics, about application, or questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A. I'm going to pause for a moment to allow questions to trickle in, and then I'll move to the last two slides, which will have information for how to contact our panelists. Okay. Let's see. Okay, and so the first question is for Crystal Mills. And I see that she's also answered it in the Q&A, but I'm going to read it out loud. The immigration status can limit the victim's participation of that program and or services. Crystal, do you want to answer that live?
Sure. Yeah. So no, as long as it's a federal crime within the jurisdiction of the FBI, will investigate it regardless of the victim's immigration status, which means that they would also access the services that I discussed. So no, immigration status does not limit their access to services as long as it's a crime within what the FBI can investigate.
Thank you so much. And another thing I just wanted to flag for everyone, I know that I saw someone say something about purchasing the resource. This resource is completely free, which is probably unheard of in the field, but it is completely free. And that was on purpose so that it is accessible for all stakeholders. And if there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and jump into just ask the panelists to share anything else that might have been missed. Oh, I see. Never mind. I think we have another question. Let's see. Are there any specific resources for males who identify as males to receive support for being exploited and or trafficked? Kate, I'm going to turn that over to you to answer.
Yes, absolutely. I thought I had pressed my unmute, but it was a little sticky there. I'll go ahead and start answering, and then also, want to give space for my fellow panelists and colleagues to answer the question. We have been doing a lot of work, particularly in this curriculum, to support individuals who identify in all different ways. So there are examples of male survivors, individuals who are male identified. In addition to Dr. Shobana Powell has also just shared some of the YAMT amazing survivor-led webinars that include topics around exploitation of males. But really, this resource is meant to focus on all gender identity, all individuals, all populations, recognizing that's a very broad scope. So that means it may be very surface level, but again, to get that baseline. So yes, it absolutely addresses that. And I think just to tag on to that, one of the things that I think is a goal for Sanar, as well as many of the panelists that I've heard echo this here, is really to develop a part 2 on different kinds of populations and the experiences that they face as sort of a follow-up post this baseline. So that would be sort of our dream for future as well, of creating additional content that can support individuals from diverse backgrounds. But I hope that answers the question, and do want to create space for anyone else who might want to share resources or examples of individuals that are represented in the curriculum.
Thank you. And for folks who may not have seen other questions in the Q&A, I'm going to read another one. Will there be any information on best practices to help human trafficking survivors who are also challenged with substance use disorders? So in the curriculum, we do cover substance misuse as a trauma response in part 1 of the 2-part curriculum. And then in part 2, we talk about different types of support and care, as well as identifying referrals for individuals who might be impacted in that way. And then the next question was, in particular, those that are C-sex survivors. So we also do talk about all forms of trafficking, including the impact of childhood abuse on lifetime experiences of violence. Let's see. Any other questions? Anything else from our esteemed panelists? Anything else you'd like to add before we move on to the contact information?
This is Shobana. If I could
go right ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing I appreciate about this curriculum is also, I think, the way that it was built follows the values that it upholds and teaches. So what I appreciated was that it was co-created with folks with lived experience who are compensated. But then also, not only was it created from beginning to end with a diverse panel of folks, but then I don't know if it was like fully highlighted the amazingness of the panel, the pilot. There were experts from across the country, from all different types of experience, including lived experience, who are unapologetically amazing and really called out challenges they saw with the curriculum as well as strengths. And then it was edited based on that. And I just love that, because that's the way I'd love to see all curriculums being developed, with that really like co-created approach with multiple diverse input and experiences. So I just wanted to highlight that. I thought that was a really beautiful aspect of this.
Thank you so much, Shobana. Yes, when we were creating this curriculum, we were very, very intentional about including as many voices as possible, especially voices who typically don't get a seat at the table, because we recognize that human trafficking touches all communities, regardless of race, gender, creed, socioeconomic background. So making sure that we had those folks at the table saying, this is not right. This is not actually how things are happening within specific communities, that has created a way for us at SANAR and at Project Trust to ensure that this curriculum is going to be as impactful and as meaningful as possible. And part of that was definitely including survivor voices, and survivor voices who are from all different backgrounds, not just racial backgrounds, but socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientation, gender identity, location in the United States. That was all incredibly important and has shown to be incredibly valuable to this end product. And so, as Kate has said, we would love to do a part 2 where we're talking a bit more in depth about some of these experiences, but that is to be decided. But we are really excited about this end product and very excited to really get it out there in the field. Is there anything else that any of our other panelists would like to say before we go ahead and wrap up?
I'll jump in just as a last word of gratitude for everyone who took time to be here for 2 hours today. I recognize that that is a lot of time for all of our amazing panelists who took the time to review the full curriculum. And also, you know, every single person who's here as a participant, we hope that this content is something that you can utilize, that is helpful for the work that you do, and that also we can work with each of you in recognizing what are some of the barriers for, you know, implementation or anything else that might come up. I know I can speak for SANAR in saying even in our process and going through this training, we learned things and changes that we needed to make internally. So we look forward to really supporting the allied community in the anti-trafficking space, allied survivor leader communities, and individuals with lived experience, and ensuring that we have continued conversations. And this is not just something that gets left by the wayside, but that continues with that momentum moving forward. So my sincere gratitude from the SANAR Institute, and definitely want to leave space for any other panelists who have anything else they would like to share today.
Thank you so much, Kate. And with that, here's the contact information for our esteemed panelists. My contact information and Kate's contact information will be on the next page. Please feel free to reach out to our panelists, as well as to visit their websites, where you can see some of the amazing work that each and every entity is doing to support survivors and individuals with lived experience in a vast variety of ways. Thank you all so very much for joining us. We are so excited for you all to check out the curriculum in its entirety, and we're excited to hopefully get to work with everyone again. And finally, here is the contact information for myself, as well as for Kate Keisel, the CEO and co-founder of SANAR, as well as our website. We thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you have found this time to be useful for your work in supporting survivors and individuals with lived experience. Thank you all very much. And with that, we are going to sign off. Have a wonderful rest of your day.